Creativity is a state of doing, not a state of being. I heard this definition in a presentation by someone who played a very important role at the MacArthur Foundation. In fact, an important role in giving out their Genius Awards. When I first heard this definition, I thought, yes, that's it. It's about producing. Creativity is not just about reflecting and thinking, it's about doing something. Then I ran into people who did creativity very well in one area, but who didn't live creativity as a way of being. So in this lecture, we'll look at the rest of the story, creativity as a way of being. We talked last time about Frank Lloyd Wright, who was recognized as the greatest American architect. He designed such famous buildings as Falling Water near Pittsburgh, the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, and the Darwin Martin House in Buffalo. In a career that lasted about 7 decades, he generated an average of more than 140 designs and 70 structures per year. So obviously, he was a prolific creator. My question is, to what degree did he also live creativity? The ability to suspend judgment or to use affirmative judgment, as you've learned in this course. To what degree did his eminent ability to do creativity translate into creativity in everyday life? Csikszentmihalyi says this is a common divide. A creative attitude in a specialized area may not be apparent elsewhere. Although he gained much from surrounding himself with apprentices, as we discussed last time, he did not pay his apprentices. In fact, he expected them to do cooking, cleaning, and fieldwork. And he continued to overlook ways he benefited from their efforts. As one apprentice who worked with him on Falling Water said, he needed people like myself to make his designs work, although you couldn't tell him that. Although Wright promised his own son, John, a salary for working on several projects with him, when John requested payment, Frank Lloyd Wright instead gave John a bill for the money John owed him starting from birth. Let me remind you of a model for the development of creative leaders and the steps in this model. As we move from a spectator, someone who may not be consciously aware of the importance of creativity. We refer to a spectator, someone standing on the sideline, kind of watching creativity going by, as someone who's unconsciously unskilled. Then, through awareness, we begin to recognize that we can put the lightning in the bottle. We don't have to wait for creativity to strike us. And we become consciously unskilled, recognizing that it's important and beginning to develop some motivation in deliberately provoking our own creativity. Then, through practice, over time, being more deliberate, we can move to a level where we become consciously skilled at our creativity. We refer to this level as the skilled practitioner, someone who can do creativity. But at the 4th level, the highest level of development, we have the creative leader, the individual who's unconsciously creative in everyday modeling creative behavior to others, someone who creates a context, a climate within the home, in organizations, in the community that promotes creative thinking among others. In this way, they serve as a transformational leader. While Frank Lloyd Wright was a super skilled creativity practitioner, someone who mastered creativity, maybe this didn't translate into his lifestyle. Maybe he didn't have a creative lifestyle or didn't operate as a creative leader, at least not in how he may have interacted with others. Skills that might have given Frank Lloyd Wright, in effect, another decade or more to do even more of the creative work he loves so much. Creative thinking skills can help anyone, whether making contributions to a larger field or overcoming daily challenges and living in a more creative way. So, this concluding lecture, we examined principles for living a creative life. The principles I'll share with you were generated by a colleague and I, David Gonzalez. We generated these principles by reviewing classic and popular books on the topic of creativity and examining them for common themes. These 6 principles represent some of the most common themes you find in these popular books. I want to explore these themes, and I will encourage you to live these themes in your life and to examine ways that you can internalize them. We'll also look at things that undermine our creativity, that stop us from being more effective, things that we perhaps should pay attention to that may rob our creativity. In fact, let's start there. Here are some things that we recognize that people do that take their creativity away, that undermines their creative power. Here's the first: letting others' approval be more important than your own. Sort of checking to see how others are reacting to you before you dive into the work, being overly cautious about how others will react to you. What this tends to do, it takes us away from our own intrinsic drive, our own internal interests. I remember when my son Anthony was young and was in gymnastics, and he was practicing routines, and in the gymnasium there was a large foyer with large glass windows, and we could look and see how the kids were engaging in their routines. And when he would try something new, immediately when he was done, he would look to me to see how I was responding. And I told him at one point, I said, "Anthony, don't worry about me. Focus on what you're doing. Focus on what the coach is trying to teach you." So as we become less concerned about others, we can focus more on what's important to us. The next way in which we can lose our creative power is by running ourselves down, always putting other people first. When we get on the airplane and the airline attendant goes through the emergency procedures, what do they tell you should the cabin lose pressure? An oxygen mask will come from the ceiling, will suspend from the ceiling. And you're to apply that to whom first? Well, they always recommend that you apply it to yourself first. The reason why is by taking care of ourselves, nurturing our own creativity, actualizing our own creativity, enhancing our creative power, we're in a better position to then enhance others and to share that power with others. The next way in which we can give up our power is asking for permission inappropriately. Looking to make sure that before we do something, we've got the permission by someone else. In this way, we're trying to avoid making mistakes. There's an old saying that sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. The next is credentializing. This is sort of looking at the field that you're going into or something that you wish to embark on, and you talk yourself down by saying, I don't have the right things on my resume yet. I don't have the right credentials. I don't have the right degree. I haven't yet had the right experiences that prove my validity in terms of this field. In that way, we're talking ourselves down. The next is demanding guarantees. Saying in your mind, I will pursue this only if I know I'll be successful. Looking for 100% guarantees of success will always stop us from pursuing something, especially something that's new to us. And then the final way in which we give up our power is being unwilling to say no, stretching ourselves too far, saying yes to everything, not taking control of decisions in our lives, and as a result, running our energy down. So now let's turn to those principles that give us creative power. The things that I just reviewed are aspects that we need to turn down the volume on in our lives. Let's now examine where we need to turn the volume up. These are habits to continue to grow or to initiate anew in your life. The first principle is to live your life. As we've talked before, intrinsic motivation is a strong predictor of those who will ultimately show high levels of creativity. Amabile has seen this in her research. Paul Torrance, in his work with inventors, found that the main reason why inventors invent is for the love of it, not because of fame and fortune. Martha Graham took up dance at age 22, which was fairly late for a dancer. But when she started, she said she had found her destiny. When I was studying for my PhD at the University of Manchester, every Monday I would go to play tennis with my doctoral supervisor's wife. She would take me to her tennis club. And I thoroughly enjoyed the courts at this tennis club. They were very different from the concrete hard surfaces that I had played on before. I especially liked the clay surfaces. And one day when we had finished playing, I commented to Liz about how much I enjoyed the surface. And she said, "You should speak to Ron. He's the groundskeeper." And I hadn't met him yet. So she introduced me to Ron. And when I first met Ron, he was sort of disheveled looking. And as we began to talk, I could see he wasn't terribly well educated. But he made a profound impact on me. As I started to talk to him about the clay courts and express my appreciation, I could see him lighting up. And he began to tell me about all the work that he did to ensure that these courts were in perfect playing condition. And he asked me, "Have you seen the grass courts yet?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, let me take you over there." And he took me over to the grass courts, and he walked me onto the grass courts, and he spent a long time telling me about all the things he had to do to make sure that the courts were just right. In a way, I thought, this is like talking to an artist. He's telling me about his artwork. The courts are his canvas. Sometime later, after I had moved back to the US and I had returned to England on a visit, I went to play tennis with Liz, and as I always do, I went to find Ron. And we started chatting, and we were both happy to see each other, and I asked him about how things were going, and I asked him, we had played that day on the grass courts, and I'd asked him what had happened to the clay courts. You see, they had removed the clay courts and they had put in an all-weather pitch for playing hockey. And as he began to tell me about this, it was almost as if he had lost a cherished possession. And it struck me from hearing Ron talk about his courts and having lost his clay courts, it struck me, here's a great example of intrinsic motivation. And it doesn't matter what intrinsically motivates you. What really matters is finding what intrinsically motivates you. Pursue what you love, and this is where you'll find your greatest creativity. This is where you'll find your flow, your peak psychological experiences. Here's the next principle. Reclaim your creativity. Early on, when I taught undergraduate courses, I would pose questions at the end of every class, and students would have to journal about those questions. And at the end of one class, I put out the question, write to me, tell me about why you think it's important to study creativity. And I remember reading one young man's journal. He wrote a simple, short answer. He said, the reason why I believe it's important to study creativity is that when we study creativity, we study ourselves. You see, creativity is natural. We're born to create, as we've talked. Evolution has wired us to be creative. In order to be creative, we have to recognize, though, how we get in the way of our own creativity, those self-imposed constraints. Sure, we can blame others, but we need to first reclaim what is a natural gift that we all have. When you create, you actualize your potential. You expand yourself. You discover yourself. When you create an idea, it's like seeing part of yourself grow. It helps you to become a larger self. And although there are some legends and myths about how, in order to be creative, it comes along with mental illness. In fact, research by many psychologists like Donald McKinnon, in fact, show the opposite. It shows that when we reclaim our creativity, in fact, we have greater coping skills and resiliency to deal with life's challenges. Because creativity just doesn't happen in our professional lives between 9 to 5. We're required to be creative in other aspects of our lives as well. So it's important that wherever we go, we bring our imagination along. Remember what Guilford said, to live is to have challenges, and to solve challenges creatively is to live a creative life. Let's go to the next principle. The next principle is go big or go home, just as the ex-gamers say. Remember, creativity is made up of knowledge, imagination, and evaluation. Children have lots of imagination. Adults, however, seem to stop dreaming. They limit their imagination. This is crucial, as Fritz says in his creative tension model. In order to create change in our lives, we have to begin by first looking at what we want. What's our desired future state? And the more the stretch goal, the more it takes us out of our comfort zone, the more compelling it becomes. It's important to be clear and unapologetic about what you want. Just like children. It's how children get their way. Picture the scene, the child in the grocery store who asks his or her parent, I want that candy bar. And the parent at first says no. And then the child says, I really want that candy bar. And the parent says no. And then the child, again, more insistently says, I really want that candy bar. And eventually the parent gives up, gives in. That's what makes the child powerful. The child is clear and unapologetic about what he or she wants, whether it's a toy or attention of that parent. We need to do the same thing. Just like John F. Kennedy, who despite what advisors had told him at the beginning of the 1960s, said by the end of the decade, we'll take a man to the moon and return him safely. Or Gandhi, who had a dream for home rule in India. And Walt Disney, who wanted to create a clean, well-organized amusement park. In their book, looking at the habits that make corporations successful over time, Collins and Porras identified a number of things that organizations did that were habitual. One of the important habits was what they called a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. Here's a description of a BHAG. 46-year-old businessman, Henry Ford. His big, hairy, audacious goal was to democratize the automobile. He was very clear in describing what this desired future state would be. He wanted to build a motor car for the great multitude. It would be so low in price that no man making a good salary would be unable to own one. The horse will have disappeared from our highways, and the automobile will be taken for granted. So in order to go big, in order to dream big, we have to be able to engage in this next principle. The next principle is called suspend disbelief. Let me tell you a story. This is a Buddhist story. In this story, there's a wealthy merchant. He's a widower. And after his wife passed away, he poured all of his love into his son. His son was the center of his world. And one day came and he had to leave his village to go conduct business elsewhere. And while he was away, some bandits came to the village and they caused great havoc. And they came to this merchant street and they looked to the end of the street and they could see a grand home. They knew the home must have belonged to someone wealthy. So they went to the home and they broke in. And they stole items and they found this merchant's son there. And they kidnapped the boy and took him away. And just out of spite, as they left, they burnt the house down. Later that day, in the evening, the merchant returned home and he looked to the end of his street and he could see the smoldering ashes of his house. And he ran to his home and he looked down, and lying there near the home was an unrecognizable figure of a small child, a small boy. He assumed that this was his son and he began to mourn. And time went by and he rebuilt his home. Now, he did not know that his son had been kidnapped. To him, his son was dead and gone. But over time, eventually, the small boy was able to escape from the bandits. And he returned one evening to his father's home. He went to the street and he saw the house. And he ran to the house, which had been rebuilt. And he knocked on the door. And he called out, "Father, I'm home. Let me in." And the father said, "No, go away. Leave me alone." And the boy knocked louder, "Father, I'm home. Let me in." And the father called back, "No, stop taunting me. Don't make fun of my sorrow. You see, he thought it was the neighborhood children who were making fun of him. And the boy knocked again, and the father refused to let him in. And eventually, the boy gave up and went away. Now, the Buddhists tell this story because they're trying to drive home the point that when we hold on to an idea, when we make a conclusion and we're not willing to be flexible, when we're not willing to suspend our disbelief, even when an opportunity comes, knocking on our door, loudly calling to us, we just might miss it. So it's crucial for us to see opportunities, to be able to suspend our disbelief, to be able to play with possibilities. There's an old saying, those who believe the sky is the limit have a limited imagination. We need to manage our judgment, to not edit our thinking prematurely. As Hemingway said, too much scrutiny early in the creative process kills creative ideas. Enough people will judge your ideas. Don't be your own worst enemy. Principle 5 is to create options. Pursuing a goal, in order to achieve it, it's helpful to have multiple options. When solving a problem, it's helpful to have multiple options. Great creators do this. Recall, they don't create just one option for themselves. Picasso, great example of this, generated 20,000 works over his lifetime. When we have a problem to solve and we have one option, it really doesn't give us a choice. It's either succeed or fail. When you create two options, well, you're in a better place, but it forces choices into a black and white scenario. When we create more choices for ourselves, we maximize our power as it allows for greater flexibility, and it increases the probability of getting to our end goal. Here's a business example. A colleague of mine was working with a group. They were generating names for a new product. And very early in the brainstorming session, they struck on an idea that they absolutely loved. And my colleague said, well, let's keep going. And they said, no, this is great. We've got what we want. And he said, no, maybe we should stretch for some more. And upon his insistence, they did. And they eventually had several hundred ideas that they generated, and they created a short list of options for themselves. Well, it's a good thing my colleague insisted that they continue to generate, because the idea that they struck on early, that they absolutely fell in love with, they found out soon afterwards that that name had already been trademarked. So they ended up going with one of the other alternatives. Principle 6, our last principle. We call it, don't just do it again and again. Creating is hard work. It takes practice and persistence. Remember the 10-year rule, that it takes 10 years on average before great creators have their breakthrough. Franklin Delano Roosevelt called this a time of persistent experimentation. Be willing to learn from your mistakes. Failure is just another way of learning. Let me share 2 thoughts on failure from 2 very different sources. Here's one. Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy nor suffer much, because they live in a gray twilight that knows not victory nor defeat. That was Theodore Roosevelt. And this one, I can accept failure. Everyone fails at something, but I can't accept not trying. That was Michael Jordan. Edison, one of the greatest inventors in US history, in his search for the filament for the light bulb, he and his team had tried 1,600 different material. One of his colleagues during this process complained that they had too many failures, and Edison said to him, "What? We haven't failed. We've learned every time, and we're now that much closer to the solution." As we practice, as we do it again and again, find a teacher to guide you, someone who will grow with you. Tennis players and golfers, even at the highest level, have coaches. Many executives have coaches today. Find a paragon that you can emulate, someone that you can look to who has a similar approach in terms of creativity, and look at what they've done. Learn from them as well. Learning without application achieves the same end as ignorance. I'd like you to look at this course and reflect on what you've taken from this course. And I'm going to take you through a quick exercise. And I'm going to encourage you to do this, to pause the video if it's helpful. I want to look at what we've learned and how you might be able to apply it. Let's begin by looking at what stood out as interesting for you. To do this exercise, you'll need a piece of paper or a computer. And if that's not handy, then picture this in your mind. It won't be terribly difficult. So we're going to begin by looking at what you found interesting and intriguing. On this piece of paper or in the computer or in your mind, draw a line down the center. And on the left side, this column is for all those things you found interesting and intriguing. So think back across the lectures that you listened to or viewed. What were the tools, the principles, the attitudes that stood out for you? What intrigued you? And make a list as long as you can of those things that caught your attention. Now, let's look at the right column on that piece of paper or your computer or in your mind. And I'd like to challenge you. For those items that you've listed in the left column, the things that you found interesting, intriguing, the things that stood out for you, the tools, the principles, the content, the attitudes that we talked about, I'd like to challenge you to think about ways that you might apply each of those items, both in your professional life and your personal life. You may need time for this, so feel free to pause. I'm going to close this lecture, this course, with a manifesto written by Paul Torrance, one of the true pioneers in the field of creativity. I think it provides a good summary for what we've learned in this course. It begins with, don't be afraid to fall in love with something and pursue it with intensity. Know, understand, take pride in, practice, develop, exploit, and enjoy your greatest strengths. Learn to free yourself from the expectations of others and to walk away from the games they impose on you. Free yourself to play your own game. Find a great teacher, a mentor who will help you. Learn the skills of interdependence. Don't waste your time trying to be well-rounded. Do what you love and can do well. Embrace your creativity. Use it every day. Share this great gift with others, and soon others will view you as a creative leader. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to visit India. And when I was there, I had the chance to go see the location where Gandhi had been assassinated. And it made quite an impression upon me. And my hosts were terrific. They shared many stories with me. And I asked them many stories about Gandhi. And one of the stories that they shared with me was this story, and I want to leave you with this. There were two parents who had a son who was often very sickly. And the mother and father were at their wits' end in terms of what to do with their son. So they thought, we need to speak to someone wise. Well, who's the wisest man in our land? Gandhi. So they went to visit with Gandhi. When they went in to meet with Gandhi, Gandhi asked what he could do. And they said, well, it's our boy. You see, he has a very poor diet and he's often very sickly, and in particular, he eats way too much sugar. Gandhi looked at them and said, I can't help you today. Please go away and come back in 3 days. They were confused. Why? But they left, and they came back 3 days later, and they met with Gandhi again. And Gandhi began by saying, how can I help you? And they started to retell the story, and he said, oh, I remember. That's right. Your son has a poor diet. He eats too much sugar. Well, can you help us? And Gandhi says, yes, I can. And he leans over and he looks at the small boy and he says, "Stop eating sugar." The parents were aghast. They were confused. "Why couldn't you say this 3 days ago?" And Gandhi looked at them and said, "I couldn't say this 3 days ago because 3 days ago I was eating too much sugar." So the point of the story is that if we wish to see change, we have to be the change we wish to see. We have to model the way for others to see. I encourage you to embrace your creativity as you go forward and model it for others. I'm very much tempted to say, and that's all, folks, but that's not all, folks. Now go for yourself and for others, and be a creative force in your work and all that you do, and live a more creative life.